Welcome, everyone, to another wonderful program as part of our Southern Art Wider World series. And before we get into the actual program, here in the pre-show, I'm joined by Zaire Love from Memphis, Tennessee. How are you, Zaire?
Hey, I'm pretty good. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. You have a good Thanksgiving?
Thanksgiving was cool, because of, the pandemic and everything. It was pretty small. It was different, but I enjoyed it. What about you?
Yeah, low key, trying to be responsible, but not responsible in the sense that I ate way too much.
Oh, wow. Yeah. You know what? I was kind of chill like this Thanksgiving. I didn't go all out like I normally do.
Well, tonight we're talking about many different things, but the title of the program is The Land Speaks, these voices across time. And one of the things you and I have been talking about offline was how nature and the landscapes have this history that's so much deeper and longer than we are. What was your experience preparing for this program? You were shooting some video, as you do, and kind of going around Memphis, and you stumbled upon or sought out a place that started to open up those stories for you. So what's your experience with that idea of the land speaking?
Yeah, for sure. I got to go to Chickalissa, which is some people say it's Choctaw, but they say it's Choctaw and Chickasaw because these two nations kind of claim it for themselves. But it's totally different from like the rest of Memphis, right? If you're going to this site, you have to know where you're going. It's not somewhere that you stumble upon. So because I saw out this land or, this place, when I got there, I had no necessary like expectations. But once I got there and began to walk on the land, it really felt like spiritual. It really felt sacred, because you understand that these mounds that were built like centuries ago by Native people, and it was so serene, and it felt like if you just looked at the sky, it felt like the sky was different. It felt like it was talking to you in the grass. And I know some people feel like this it is not necessarily something that people talk about, but it really was very, very much so a spiritual feeling. You felt like you were communing with, these native ancestors, or that's how I felt. And just to know like how this piece of land was like found, and it was found in the 1930s by African American like folks who were digging for a Negro for swimming pools at this Negro park that they were about to build, that is now T.O. Fuller, National Park and stuff like that. So I just really thought that it was really a dope experience, and I got to do that with my nephew, so he got to experience a lot of that too, and he's 7, and so it was a wonderful experience.
Yeah, if there's anything people can do, even though there's a pandemic, it's go to places that are wide open and out there. And yeah, the land has such a history that none of us can even fathom. But our guest tonight, Professor LeAnne Howe, is going to help us talk through some of those things. So we'll be joining with her in just a couple of minutes. But before we do, I want to remind everybody out there that we have an interactive program. So wherever you're watching, if it's Facebook, YouTube, you can drop in comments, questions, and we can pull those onto screen. So we're always curious where you're coming from. So go ahead and let us know where you're coming from, tuning in from. And certainly if you have questions or comments during the program, let us know that as well. But that being said, just sit back and take a ride with us. Another episode, another program in Southern Art Wider World.
It all starts in the southern part of the map. The influence the globe, ain't nothing harder than that. We way smarter in fact than the stories that you heard about us. Determination and birth the image, we learn to progress. It's all a process, rebuild and regrow. When the value's much more than the silver and gold. See, the stories passed down through the soil and the dirt, and we rose from the ashes, so we loyal to the earth. And we royal from our birth, see the beauty of the landscape. Gulf Coast waters crashing on the sandbanks. It's like a diamond but hitting in plain sight. Gotta let the light shine, concealing it ain't right. So I take my time, turn the page, make a line. How I feel when I'm in the Mississippi state of mind.
The cotton grows high, the time moves move slow, ain't the river belong just to get us on home to Mississippi, to get us on home to Mississippi, where they say, bless your heart, baby, bless your heart, bless your heart, baby, bless your heart.
I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities. A grant from that institution, that agency, has made all this possible. So couldn't do it without the NEH. And then, of course, our partners here in Mississippi are very important as well. The Mississippi Humanities Council also supporting this program. And this is all in partnership with the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi. So before we do go any further, I want to briefly introduce Professor LeAnne Howe, who's the Edson Distinguished Professor at the University of Georgia, and she connects many different threads which are going to be compelling for this dialogue, including her own literature and literary work, but indigenous knowledge, native histories, expressive cultures. She's the author of many different publications and books. She's edited a ton of work and been recognized all across the map for that work. And one of the books we're going to talk about tonight is Shell Shaker, which is a novel, but based in a lot of this history of the land, of the Choctaw Nation, and just of the South more generally. But before we do, on the other side of this video that I'm about to play, we will be joined by LeAnne. I wanted to take you inside the vault at the museum with curator Maddie Codling, who's going to introduce a work by Walter Anderson, one of the works that grounds this conversation. So let's go into the vault.
Today we're going to look at the Earthsea Sky Vase. This vase is created by Walter Anderson, and it was a cast piece designed in the 1930s to be reproduced over and over again, and is composed of 3 bands featuring Earth, Sea, and Sky. This piece is borrowing from many different global cultures and their concepts of the universe. An interesting aspect about this piece is that it tells us a lot about Walter Anderson's worldview. By going out into nature, he was able to tap into different realities. The sky band is crowned by a pelican. Walter Anderson had a very deep connection to pelicans, even living with them on the Chandeleur Islands. You could probably say that if Walter Anderson had a spirit animal, it would probably be the pelican. In the middle section, we have animals such as a panther, a rabbit, and then even a hunter traversing the earth. The middle band is almost a biography of the land itself, showing how humans interacted with the plants and animals of the Gulf Coast. And Anderson saw himself as participating in the centuries-old story. The bottom band depicts the sea. Powerful fish and waves flow throughout this piece, and it really speaks to Anderson's connection with these powerful forces of nature.
Well, Professor LeAnne Howe, how are you this evening?
I'm fine. Delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me to join this conversation.
Oh, we're excited about it. And, with that as a bit of a primer, we've had discussions in preparing for this program, and you've helped Zaire and I really expand our understanding of on many different fronts. But one of the things that's really interesting, and why I like that piece that we just looked at, was because of the structure of the universe, this idea of the nature of reality. Can you just start us on that broad, from that broad perspective, and give us a sense of certainly Choctaw and indigenous more broadly, perhaps, this architecture of the universe that underpins so much of all of our cultures, but also specifically the Choctaw culture?
Well, to speak about Choctaw, you also have to evoke the Mississippian period, because so much of our artwork comes out of that Mississippian period that really spans, if you have a map in your head of the lower Mississippi Valley from Texas, Louisiana, all the way over to a strain of Florida, then that middle band, you were showing a piece of art that was banded. Well, for us, the middle band of that region was something that we had purview over as Choctaw people. And a lot of that art that's part of that expressive culture comes out of this period. For instance, the Choctaw universe for us is laid out east to west, and it's a body with the head really part of the Alabaman territory. Alabaman really represented the head. The arms, the left and the right of the arms, were reaching to the Gulf and all the way up into Tennessee, North and South Carolina. So you have this body that's laid out on the land, and the feet are part of the Louisiana territory. So it's expressive culture. It also, for Choctaws, especially at that time, it represented the power base of our people. And our earth and sky stories, much of them come out of this Mississippian period. And I want to show you a piece of art that I have. It's of the twins, the hero twins, but it is rendered in a southeastern ceremonial kind of, I don't know if we can see this very clearly, but these are the twins. They're both they're part of the sky beings above us. And so you find a lot of early Mississippian art, Choctaw art, where you've got the sky world and the lower world. And then we humans are in the middle earth. And so those are things that informed our architecture, and also a great deal of our stories and culture of the way in which we situated ourselves on the land. So especially the period that I'm most familiar with, which is the 18th century, but the early 18th century, we have a lot of documents in which the French were fascinated about kind of the nature, the mysterious, the nature of Choctaw and Choctaw, greater Choctaw societies, how we situated ourselves. And a lot of that pivots around the natural world. For instance, the female. We're a matrilineal, matriarchal society, but that is mirrored by so many of the animal world. Pardon me. Because if you look at bear and bear clans, you can see that the power of the female, her caregiving, is what nurtures the young cubs. The same is true about panther. You showed that vase with panther. We have panther in the sky, but we also have panther that was very much and still remains very powerful to us as Native people. And in Oklahoma, when we were removed in the 1830s to Oklahoma, where I'm speaking to you from now, which is in Ada, Oklahoma, was known as Panther City because we had panthers that were sleeping in the dusty early streets of Ada, Oklahoma. And so our nickname is Panther City. And it's one of the mascots for the town and the community is Panther. And so I think that we have continued so much, and what Shell Shaker is about, so much of Choctaw culture over the centuries, over time, is invisible to mainstream people. And it's less so now in the 21st century. We're rebuilding our mounds. You all were talking about mounds and mound culture. Choctaws built early mounds throughout the lower Mississippi Valley. Some of them were in animal shape. Some of them are conical mounds. Here in Ada, And further down, we have mounds that are being rebuilt by tribal people today. So this is we're talking about the Naniwaya, which is our mother mound, is well over 2,000 years old. So we're talking about a very long, deep ecological history of people in the lower Mississippi Valley. So when we're removed in 1830 and up through the one of my colleagues says the removal continued until 1902. What we tried to do was re-represent ourselves in water, air, earth. Here in what becomes Oklahoma, but it was Indian Territory before that, we built mounds. The same kind of architecture that we were building 2,000, 2,500, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, we replicated here in the new territory. So that is the mystery. That is the power of knowing the landscape, taking into consideration all that is alive, including animals, plants, and the plants speak to us as we speak back to the plants, especially corn. So all of these things go into making and the continuity of our culture over centuries of time. So it's quite special to all of us in Choctaw culture, Chickasaw culture, certainly, and the tribes that were removed from Mississippi and and the Southeast. So I love the way you brought out the urn. That I think there is something more special going on in Anderson's project because he banded it the way in which indigenous people thought about the sky people, the middle people, and the lower people, which are fish, underwater people, are relatives as well. That's why we have alligator dance and alligator power. So to my mind, when I look at this piece, I think he is adapting to the kind of cultural lifeways that we also expressed in our artwork. So they're not unknown to each other, even across these millennia. That to me says that he was tapping into the power that's all around us as we live and nurture this land. He himself was caught up and became in tune with the cosmos.
Yeah, I think that's really intriguing and important for us to think about, because he's borrowing from other cultural traditions and aesthetics, but his knowledge of this fundamental reality and the dynamism of nature was experiential. I mean, he right. We'll talk about this later, but he like you were alluding to, came in close contact with alligators and saw them not as foes but friends. And so there's so much that you have to appreciate from even from what Zaire was talking about. When you actually venture out into nature, then it can speak to you and give you messages, even if you might not have the historical knowledge or even awareness that you're actually participating in this larger story. One of the things I wanted to ask you about with Shell Shaker, because I think it's so important and interesting, is you're having this conversation in this novel, which is very much undergirded by history, obviously, and one of your characters is a historian as well. But it's a contemporary narrative in the sense that you're following on one hand, folks who are, in the 20th century, but then there's this pull back into the past and delving into a lot of these ideas where we travel through time and get to experience the distant past as well. But when you were approaching that book specifically, and the other projects that are in line with this, I am curious about this idea of representation. I mean, some of your characters talk about, that, why are people focused on Indian warfare instead of Indian commerce? That's one quote. Or one of the characters is
Adair says that, yeah. Why would we think of warfare when we think of commerce? And that's very true of Native people, because we're trading, and we're trading the essences of our culture, because there are all kinds of trade goods, but that are practical, but also spiritual. So when Zaire was talking about walking on the land and being in Chalissa, that's very much the experience, I think, of Native people when we're walking on the land and being in conversation with that land, letting it speak to us. And I really do think he was in his artwork, he was expressing that relationship, and it may not be exactly the analog, but it may not be the same, but it is an expression and the experiences of people that come to this place. So I think it works its way through all of us who are open to those kinds of experiences.
Yeah. Well, let's segue there, and we'll pick it right back up. But we're going to turn it over to Zaire, or at least the film that is standing in her stead, and she also put together this meditation on the kind of the banded reality, these three levels of the universe.
The lives of Mississippian societies were not myth or legend. They were real and spanned across centuries of teachings and beliefs. According to the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, there are three levels to the universe: upper world of the sky, middle world of the earth, and underworld of the water. They are connected by a red and white striped pole or tree. The upper world is the sky that is ruled by the lunar goddess, the lord of the wind and lightning and the thunders. The middle world is the land surface upon which humans live. The underworld is where water is ruled by a sacred animal interpreted as a great serpent and an underwater panther. From the earth, the underworld is entered through caves and bodies of water. When humans die, the great serpent ferries them along the path of souls to the underworld.
So to give Anderson, and of course a beautiful piece by Zaire, but to give Anderson a little bit of a space here to say something through his words, this was a quote that I was taken by in this context, because he is talking about, in a very poetic way, his expression and perception of different ways of being in the world. Some walk on earth, others on water, still others need clouds to walk on. I think there's an artist and an ego, a healthy ego in that too. Artists want to create something that transcends, but it also goes back to what we were talking about. And where I want to open this next segment up is to talk to you and ask you about the past, because we're going to hear shortly show some of Anderson's work that is about the founding of Ocean Spring. And you alluded to the French coming here, but this idea of control of the land, the historical saga that led to Indian removal ultimately, but also, it's more complicated than many people know. But in terms of the past and this history, first of all, how does it function in your work, which was where we left it in the last segment? How do you try to weave together the past? And then let's talk a bit about the French and Choctaw relationship and see how that might surprise people as well. But let's start with just past generally. What does the past mean to you when you're trying to craft a story?
Well, I think that the past is always with us. And I don't think of the past as something that happened before. I think it's ongoing. and that's the way it works through my work. But that's also, I mean, we have another Southerner who says very much the same thing. The past isn't even past. Past is not past. In fact, it's not dead. It's not even past. And that's Faulkner, who also is another writer from the lower Mississippi Valley. And I had a chance to, I was the scholar in residence for the University of Mississippi several years ago. And I spent a great deal of time thinking about the past, but I want to come back to that because I don't think the past is past. I think it exists alongside the future and it exists alongside the present. So we are also made up of these three realities that are working through us at all times. And that's why I think that for people who are in touch and want to be in touch with the mystery, that is, you're able to understand who has come before and who will come after you. It's a beautiful way to stand in relations with the universe. And I think that may have been, I know that that's something that my community is very strong in looking at the past, but I also think it's very much a part of Anderson's work. He is living in the past as in the present and in the future at the same time. And we see something like that in William Faulkner's work, as he was a writer, and telling the story of so many things that had come before. So I don't know that I think we can actually pinpoint past, present, and future. We can in our language, but we're living in these bands of, and sometimes sliding back and forth. That's the nature of inspiration, and it's also the mystery. So I just, earlier today, I had another program with Choctaws, and we were talking about some of these very similar things. We're always in touch, trying to be in touch, trying to center oneself so that we are part of the landscape and are able to be in touch with our ancestors. That's very important.
Yeah, and I think we all need to cultivate, or I'll speak for myself, cultivate a language to try to conceptualize these ideas, because without knowing it, it's what Anderson called the dominant mode on shore, on the mainland. This idea that modern life gives us a certain vernacular and a certain way of conceptualizing things, but in reality, there are other things going on, and that's just echoing your point. And what I loved about reading Shellshaker is that it really is as if the past is just visiting upon us in the present, and it's not a recollection of something that happened before. It's really a message that's being borne out. And so often, certainly in Shellshaker, but I think across the board, the message is being brought by nature in some, whether that's the wind or a sunrise or some other creature that's kind of bringing a message. So I thought that was incredibly fascinating. And I wanted to ask you, and we can have you read as well, but kind of show Anderson's, some of his renderings of the kind of French arrival. So of course, D'Iberville was the one who founded Ocean Springs, and Pierre Lemoyne, Sieur d'Iberville, and his brother Bienville, of course, the founder of New Orleans, was reconnoitering the islands, including Horn Island, and also very, of course, important is the founder of New Orleans ultimately. So, when that happened, of course, the Biloxi tribe were one of the local nations here, but also specifically with Bienville, the Choctaw became very closely aligned. So do you mind giving us a sense of part of that history? And certainly if you want to read a bit, because I know you write specifically about that history.
Bienville and the French come, as we all know, in 1699, and it's his brother d'Iberville that is in charge, but he's not here very long. D'Iberville gets sick and dies of yellow fever, and that leaves Jean-Baptiste Bienville in charge. So he reckons right away that not only does he learn Mabila and Choctaw, one's a trade language, but he learns Choctaw because he goes to live in Chickasahaway, and he stays there because he knows he needs the protection of a guardian tribe. Now, when most of us are taught this history, it's that, well, the French helped the Indians, and the French did this, the French did that. They didn't have a pot to piss in. And, well, it's true. They didn't like our corn, they didn't like our food, but they grew it and cultivated it so they wouldn't starve to death. And many, they were here, the French were here until what, 1775, something like that. And that relationship, Bienville is eventually sent back to France, and Pontchartrain and several others that I have to reboot my memory, work to make a home in the lower Mississippi Valley, in New Orleans and the surrounding area. But in 1699, the two brothers set foot on what is now Ocean Springs, Mississippi, near Biloxi. This became France's toehold in Louisiana. And I think that's very important that people around the country understand that they were also being protected, being traded with, and fed by Choctaw people. And this ritual of giving and reciprocity really is something that Bienville understood, because he could see that that's the way that the Choctaw society worked, with reciprocity. So he adopts, this is maybe too much, but he sends his nephew, little Elaine, to live with us so that little Elaine would know the language, be adopted by, and learn the cultural lifeways of the Choctaw, not the other way around. They were trying to learn from us how to live on this land, and they did. So it was very important to me to write this book, because I wanted people to understand the power of Native people in the lower Southeast, across the Southeast. The lower Mississippi Valley is alive with the history of Native people, and it acts on Southerners. They become more like us instead of us becoming just part of them. For instance, the language, the culture, the food, the land that they're living on, they're not trying to make, they are at first, but they're not trying to make little France. They're trying to learn to live in our world, in our territory. So what does that mean? That means that women were in control of what happens, where we're going to live. It's a woman's house. A man moves in with her, but if he doesn't stay, so what? She has the home, she has and holds the land and all the children. So everything becomes part of her community. So in the South, that translates into kind of a matriarchy, a family that is headed by grandma, mother, and that life way is very strong in Southern culture. Grandma makes decisions. Grandma tells everybody what they need to be doing. So that non-Indians become much more like us than we become like French women, for example, or English women. It's just the opposite. And when you begin to scratch the surface and look through these documents, which Jackson, Mississippi holds the French Provincial Archives, they're fascinating. And so when I wrote this book, I spent 10 years researching the history and reading through these French documents that have been translated into English, Spanish documents that have been translated, to look and see what they were really saying as opposed to just reading the historians. So I think of Shell Shaker as a history as told by a Choctaw woman. That's why they're all women that are very powerful in this book. And the 7 sisters who are transformed into birds, who flew over the heads of our enemies and essentially crapped on their heads, which was a funny story to tell, but it's also emblematic of the power of women in Southeastern society. And I find that resonates with the Southern culture even today.
I do love that, because even just this week, we were, as a museum, another museum project, working on some story gathering around the Anderson family matriarchy, if you will. I mean, certainly there were this very strong men who were in the family as well. But if you go back to the land, the literal land that became Shearwater pottery, which is where the family really became enmeshed in Ocean Springs, that was because the matriarch of the family, Annette McConnell Anderson, came over and wanted this land because she saw some promise in it. And then so many generations of women, even though Walter Anderson has his name on the museum, so many generations of women are the ones who brought up these sons, and then ultimately the daughters who also came. And that's a good segue to bring in actually a comment from Walter Anderson's daughter, Mary, who has been telling several really interesting anecdotes here in the comments, but she's talking about the family home where they would walk along the sandbars and find these pieces of pottery, these shards. And she, of course, is an artist in her own right and thinks in these same ways. But I think it's really important I love that connection. I hadn't necessarily said it or thought about it in those terms, but that much more than you, as you said, became you being the royal you, as the Choctaw women became French Victorian women. It was more the other way around, that the people who came to this country, although they were here for conquest, also were changed forever by this landscape. It's really important, I think, to take away.
And it takes a long time to get a toehold in for the French to get a toehold. So who are the men marrying and making children with? Well, it would be us and tribal people. And that relationship and that cooperation really develops into what we see today as part of Southern culture, because it's made up of many households. And I think that one of the things that I tried to do was to capture that with this women, that in Tekaliha, the sisterhood that helped in the past and helped in the present in the novel that I wrote. And things are very specific. Things happen. And if you go back to those French provincial archives and you really look at the dates that things are happening, when they decide to move against another tribe, or when they've all talked together for the last month and gone on and on. All of these events, these major events, happen around the movement of the earth. The Choctaws will not move until the autumnal equinox. That's so important, and it's missed if you don't think of the way people thought about power. When night and day are even, you have a chance to slip in and change the nature of the power dynamic. Those things happen and continue to happen around the Ides of March, the autumnal equinox, all of those earth-sky connections come into play when we make moves throughout that long period to maintain our power in the lower Mississippi Valley. So today, which is really cool, we continue to meet, have our biggest Choctaw meeting in this in-between time, this girls' time, and when it changes during the autumnal equinox. And that's not something that everybody sits around and talks about, but we know it. You know, it's a long historic memory of when we come together and have our big celebration in Oklahoma. It's always at this time. It moves, the dates move, but we're doing it around August and September. And the Mississippi Choctaws do a very similar thing. It's just the time when, you know, the universe has opened up for us, so to speak. And those kinds of things, I think, that Southerners do, and Mr. Anderson is no different. They do it by nature. And this would be a good time for this to happen, and so forth and so on. And because we're all compelled by the same universe. And I think that's worth mentioning, that cooperation with earth, sky, water, and when those kinds of things happened, we're still compelled by them, all of us across this region.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing that we've learned from interpreting Anderson's art and his writings and his philosophies, it's that this internal kind of biology, this clock we have, if we want to call it that, like you're saying, is governed by much larger forces than a wristwatch. It's something that's been going and building for all of time, which is all of time contained in this time, as we've been saying. So I want to continue this thread, but we're going to toss it over to Zaire's short film here, and this is about her trip to the Mound.
Chucalissa means abandoned house in Choctaw. Before Europeans came to this land, Native Americans thrived near the mighty Mississippi River. This Mississippian mound complex was constructed between AD 1000 and 1500. It was built on top of a bluff above the waters of the Mississippi. This village was a part of a larger civilization whose capital was located in the current-day downtown Memphis. Mississippian societies were not solely about geographic region, but also a particular time period. They practiced platform mound building. Mound building happened in stages across generations until they became the height that they are today. Native Americans from tribes such as the Choctaw and Chickasaw thrived in villages like Chucalissa, building houses, growing food, raising families, playing games, and making art. This is Chucalissa.
So yeah, continuing this idea, and I love Zaire. You know, she's walking up in her,
Yeah,
in her Nikes or whatever on this site, and there's this idea of time being collapsed upon itself. And Anderson was, during the 30s, was painting these murals that were contrasting and really comparing more than contrasting societies that were here before both the French and then ultimately people in Ocean Springs, the modern 1930s Ocean Springs. He was contrasting that with this indigenous world that preceded it. And I just love the idea that those things, it is not this chronological thing. It's something that is, like we said, on top of one another and coexistent. But I do want to ask you kind of about the, nature and some of the specifics. You write in the book, these are just examples of things. One of your characters says that, she will grow and sprout like green corn, references the cypress trees, blazing reds and yellows, the forest breathing heavily around me, all these ideas that I think we've been kind of dancing around and getting at, which is that nature is speaking in so many different ways. And that was really where Anderson saw a lot of his visionary understanding, was through the actual animals and plants that were living and breathing and innovating and adapting and dying and being reborn all around him. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the examples, either in your own life and in writing the book, but also just more generally about some of the ways that nature is, the wisdom of nature actually helps to conceptualize and characterize what it means to be human?
Oh, that's a big question. I guess I want to bring it back to something that is, I guess, meaningful and part of the mystery to me. So we're talking about the mounds, and throughout Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the culture built this east-west corridor of mounds, and of course they go up into Tennessee and North Carolina. But so I did a research project on the mounds in 2000, from 2014 till 2018. We had a large SSHRC grant to go visit all of the mound complexes that we could in that 4-year period. And one of the mounds that we visited is Emerald Mound. And one of our methods and methodologies for being in touch with the mounds were to a team of Native archaeologists, playwright, myself, another writer, and a performer, theatrical performer, visited the mounds. And one of the things that we did to try to be in touch with nature was to really lay body to body on top of these mounds and listen and listen and listen and listen and stay in that pose for as long as we could during the day or evening or sunrise, trying to let this land speak to us. And it does. So when we were at Emerald Mound, this was the practice that we brought to study the mounds. And she began to breathe with us. So after a very long time of laying, we finally believed that we were in touch with the mystery, that Emerald Mound, she was moving with us. And we stayed in that pose almost all day. There were other visitors around, so occasionally we have to move. But the mound was breathing, and we synchronized our breathing with that mound back and forth. The other interesting thing that happened to all of us on this mound quest, as it were to be very cognizant of what animals were leading us and where. So sometimes we were led by birds. You're talking about Mr. Anderson's understanding of pelicans and the way he looked at birds. They led us along with snakes. We had 2 birds, 2 snakes that were in the water right below us, and we followed them as long as we could keep up. They, in our way of doing things, and our methodology was that they led us to investigate other pieces of the land. So we had a lot of otter. We had an otter which was in the waterway system, and that was around St. Louis, that came to us and led us. Same thing with butterflies. We were surrounded once by butterflies that seemed to be leading us. So I think what he was doing is something that we did and something that our ancestors did, was to be in touch with the earth and sky and all of those things contained herein. And we absolutely, at one mound site, and I'll stop there, but at one mound site, we had, our practice was to go to the mound and try to breathe with her. But at one site, we actually heard the high-pitched singing of a small child's voice, little girl voice. And we picked up her song as we were laying on the mound. There was a high-pitched, miraculous sound of a girl singing. So all of these things opened up to us when we opened ourselves up to the natural world. And I think that's something that natives have done. I certainly think this is something that Walter Anderson was doing, but I also think it's something that artists teach us. You know, we look today to our artists to be prophets of understanding the world around us. We get that through art now. But at other ancient times, everybody used this source of knowledge to be able to learn how to live with the land. What does the land want us to do? That was the question, the first research question that we asked. So we have a long history of working in that project, and out of that work we created a new play, songs, and taught ourselves what we think the mounds were asking us to do. And that was to be very respectful, to not dig into them, and not have them destroyed. So I think we had about, I may be misremembering, but I think we visited 18 mounds from Canada, Peterborough, all the way down to Louisiana, and then across over to Florida. It was a monumental task, but well worth it.
I love that the way that your process brings in these kind of excursions and what you call it a quest, and your collaborators as well, when y'all are making this contemporary work. And I do want to ask you, because we kind of promised it earlier about alligators, but also the title of the book, Shell Shaker. I think that's maybe a good thing to visit here too. But yeah, can you just tell us about the kind of turtle shell and alligator? Because what I think is also fascinating is, living things also become artifacts sometimes when they die. I mean, we leave our bodies behind, and that doesn't mean that they don't have uses afterwards. And that you mentioned to me the case with alligator. Not only can it be food, but also for shields and so forth. So can you tell us about alligators and maybe turtle shells in the context of what we've been engaging?
Well, shell shakers wear turtle shells, and that are dried and taken care of, and then you use them to shake shells with. And in the Southeastern culture, only women shake shells. Men do not shake shells, and women do not sing around the fire. Men call to the fire, call that power. So the shells are also emblematic of the animal and the turtle, and taking that earth and getting in rhythm to dance and to honor the ancestors. So many Southeastern tribes have shake shells. Women shake shells, and it becomes part of the dance. Interestingly enough, we also have a dance that is the alligator dance. And one of the reasons I think this is so powerful is because alligator represents a certain kind of power. There you go. There it is. That we tried to be in relation and stand in good relations with that power. So alligator is the way in which we made relations with other tribes through alligator dance, alligator song, and of course alligator also became food. And so I have a lot of scenes in the book Shell Shaker with alligator and that power. And interestingly enough, the Caddo, which we are also relatives to or have many intermarriages and have done that for donkey's years, also have alligator song and dance. And so it's a very powerful, very, very powerful emblem and symbol for that kind of mysterious power. So we're still in touch with the alligator. And I know now you see a lot of alligator wrestling, and it's become kind of a sideshow. I don't know if any of you have seen that, but they're so incredible in the water, and fearsome. So back in those documents I was talking about, they talk about that when they would go learn to follow the Choctaws, because when they would move, they'd move in this kind of alligator stance and fight this way. And that was fascinating to me because I never thought about it, that you would use the animal method to conquer or to combat an enemy that was coming in. So I learned so much about animals. I really learned a lot about how people lived in the 18th century and what they took and adapted from each other. It's a fascinating, fascinating time in our history.
Yeah. Well, this has been so fun and engaging, and I do want to leave us with one kind of question, and we can do final thoughts and maybe bring Zaire back in here. So Zaire, get ready and put your earrings on. I'm going to pull you in here in a moment. But the question I want to pose to y'all two, and LeAnne, you can go first. Y'all are both artists, but you were alluding to this earlier about how artists have this role of interpreting things for us and making meaning, but also that in your case, it's such an important responsibility to, whether you want to call it amending history or shining a light on histories that have not been quite understood or misremembered, perhaps. But you had this great, and it's a character of yours that says this, so I'm not going to attribute it to you, but you wrote it on behalf of his character. And she talks about referencing an appearance she made going over her scholarship, and that she was not a William Faulkner Indian, this perverse idea of the mute character of the Southern literati. So, this idea, which I think it's important to point back to Faulkner, since you've kind of presented us this opportunity, because it does offer a counterpoint. There's so many histories, just like there are so many times. And so I guess the just kind of open-ended question to kind of bring it all to a close here is, for you and then for Zaire, in your work, to what degree is that the guiding light, or one of them, is to do right by the past, the ancestors, in a contemporary way, to tell stories that haven't really been told before?
I wrote Shell Shaker as an intervention into Southern history and Southeastern culture. I'm intervening in a very painful way in which people, especially at my age, people would say things to me growing up like, well, we're not just looking at you like a dirty Indian, but you are, this is your history, and would say these outrageous things to me as I was growing up. Well, you're just an Indian, and the best you could do, honey, is maybe you could be a teacher's aide. So I wrote it because I was reclaiming the powerful stories that my relatives, my uncles, my aunts, my mother would tell about our history. So, but the one thing that I did say is that one of the characters, Autumn, says, if she thinks I'm one of those perverse William Faulkner Indians, a mute character of the Southern literati, she has another thing coming. And I meant that to pierce people who think, well, they didn't have anything to offer, that's why they had to be removed. They couldn't even grow food for themselves. I have been told that in my lifetime. So this book is one of those projects that took me 10 years of research. I was at the Smithsonian and the Newberry Library. Of course, all the historical records that I could find from here to New York about the Choctaws. It took a long time to write this book, and it's a love letter to our past. And as Faulkner would say, the past is never dead. It's always with us.
Beautiful. Well, Zaire, I want you to weigh in and close us out, because you're a part of this, generation, you and I, who are doing some of this work, standing on the shoulders of folks like LeAnne, who have been doing it before us. So, but in your work, in perhaps from a different perspective, but what is this? How does this conversation make you think about what's driving you to do filmmaking?
Oops. I think it's the same. I think it is, reclaiming. It's not retelling, because the ancestors have been here, right? It just hasn't been their voices. Well, my ancestors have been here. It just hasn't been their voices. So it's like reclaiming those stories and to put our voices and our authentic, way of being in these stories, because like LeAnne said, these mute characters, but for my ancestry that I know of, Black folk, it hasn't necessarily been, it has been muted, but it's also been given a voice that's not always authentic to what, how Black folk feel, especially in the South with the work that I do. So in all of my work, it is to honor and amplify the voices of not only, Black folks here, in this time, but those who came before us who have had no voices to, speak. So that's very, very important to me, and to just really honoring the folks that came before us, because they definitely, definitely deserved it, and to be archived and to be put on the record,
Wonderful. That's so lovely. Well, I guess that's a good place to leave it. And I just want to thank you, LeAnne, for joining us. It's been wonderful. Thank you for sharing so much of yourself, not just your knowledge, but of yourself. It's been a real pleasure, and we're humbled. And thank you, Zaire, again for doing all you do. So that being said, we'll sign off now and wish everyone a wonderful evening and holiday season. Until next time, this has been Southern Art, Wider World.
Show